This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 165 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. With my 15 transactions column and podcast, sometimes I let you guys decide who I'm going to feature. Even if I don't have a strong enough stance on that player, I try to dig in and create that stance based on evidence that I uncover. That way it's a win-win. I'm analyzing a situation deeper, and you guys are able to get a transaction that you want. That's sort of what happened this week. I was curious as to what was going on with David Johnson, and my plan was to write about it in my weekly column, The Report. But so many of you guys hit me up on Twitter asking me what to do with David Johnson. So that's where we're going to start today. We're going to start with David Johnson. Before that, though, I wanted to remind you guys about NumberFire Premium. With NumberFire Premium, you can get awesome daily fantasy football tools, gambling predictions, and great premium content from NumberFire's brilliant writers. All Late Round Podcast listeners get their first month of any level of premium access for just $9.99 with promo code CHAMPION. For more info, visit NumberFire.com/premium. That's NumberFire.com/premium. Sell or hold David Johnson. No, I'm not buying David Johnson right now. I don't know how you could buy David Johnson. In 2 games, the Arizona Cardinals have run 94 plays. That's 13 fewer than the 31st ranked Dallas Cowboys. They're averaging just 3.72 yards per play, which is the lowest in the league, and they've seen fewer than 17 yards per drive, which is only better than Buffalo. Offensive situation matters a whole lot for fantasy football running backs. I've talked about this statistic in the past, but over the last 5 years, the average NFL offense, the ordinary NFL offense, has averaged about 37 touchdowns per season. Among the top 50 running backs over this time, so we're looking roughly at the top 10 each season, only 2 came from offenses that scored fewer than 30 times. All the while, the average number of touchdowns scored in those top 50 runners' respective offenses has just been over 42, which is well above the league's average. Good fantasy football running backs generally are coming from good offenses. And the lack of plays that Arizona is running is a big concern. In 2016, which was the season where David Johnson went absolutely bananas in fantasy football, he handled 73.4% of the team's carries, and he saw 18.6% of the team's targets. This year, those numbers are actually pretty similar. He's seen 70% of the team's carries and 18% of the team's targets. Everyone's complaining about his volume, though, but the real reason that he's not seeing volume is because Arizona's not running many plays, because they're so ineffective offensively. Situation matters. But David Johnson's also not being deployed the same way as a pass catcher. 2 years ago, David Johnson compiled 558 air yards and a 4.7 average depth of target. That's according to airyards.com. That air yards total that year was far more than double what the second-ranked Duke Johnson saw at the running back position. And according to Pro Football Focus, David Johnson ran 31.8 routes per game that season. He ran a route on about 75% of Arizona's dropbacks. Now this season, Johnson's average depth of target is down to 0.8, and he's running a route on approximately 52% of Arizona's dropbacks. He's not being utilized the same way that he was under the previous regime. That's not going to impact his bottom line numbers quite like the offensive situation will, but it is something that could impact his weekly floor. That's a scary thing. So the overall question here is, what exactly do you do if you've got David Johnson? Well, I think the first thing that you have to do is recognize that things can change quickly in the NFL. There was already talk out of Arizona on Monday surrounding Johnson's overall usage, and head coach Steve Wilks did note that they want to utilize DJ more in the slot. That's an encouraging sign. They're recognizing that there's a problem. And there's also a chance that we eventually see a quarterback change. Now, that's not guaranteed to help David Johnson, but it could also end up being a big boost for his production. It's really hard to imagine things being much worse than they are right now. But on the flip side, I get it. We haven't seen any of this actually happen. The fact that we're in this position in the first place is kind of troublesome. How can we really trust that a team that's looked so awful offensively, how can we trust that they can all of a sudden help their star running back become more productive? So you can do one of 2 things if you have David Johnson, which I talked about at the top. You can either hold him and cross your fingers, or you can sell him now and not have to worry about it anymore. It really depends on the trade offer that you receive. I just know one thing. Right now, it does not feel like the time to be buying David Johnson. Add John Brown. So John Brown's going to see some negative regression in the touchdown column because he scored twice in the first 2 games of the season. But that doesn't mean that he's not going to be a good fantasy asset for you in 2018. He's currently 9th in the NFL in air yards, and he's seen roughly 15% of Baltimore's targets so far this season. Now, that target share number isn't that good, but deep threats like John Brown don't need a crazy amount of volume to work out. He's out there on over 75% of ESPN.com leagues, and he's a perfect bench player who can play as a fill-in or a potential flex for you. But there is some upside with John Brown as well. Buy Aaron Jones. So chances are the person who drafted Aaron Jones in your league is probably more excited than you are about his return this week after being suspended in weeks 1 and 2. But there's also a chance that I, JJ, might be more excited than that person who drafted Aaron Jones. Through 2 games this season, Jamal Williams has played 61.3% of Green Bay snaps, and he's seen 73.8% of the team's rushes. Those are both pretty good numbers. But he hasn't been very effective. On his 31 carries, he has just a 38.71% success rate. That's a measurement of the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a running back according to NumberFire's net expected points metric. Now, the league average usually hovers around 40%, which means Jamal Williams is below or at the league average. But he's just done nothing extraordinary. And that's emphasized even further by the fact that he's forced 0 missed tackles according to Pro Football Focus. But here's the thing, and I talked about this before on this podcast. Jamal Williams is good in pass protection, so the worry is that Green Bay keeps him on the field even if he is just a plotter. But I do think given his week 1 and week 2 performances, Aaron Jones has an opportunity here. Last year, Aaron Jones became just the 17th running back since 2000 to finish a season with at least a .15 rushing net expected points per rush rate to go along with a 50% success rate. Basically, Aaron Jones was a unicorn last year. And other names on that list include Priest Holmes, Michael Turner, Marshall Faulk, and Larry Johnson. All of them were very successful fantasy football running backs. And among all running backs with 50 or more carries last year, Aaron Jones saw the largest discrepancy in his yards per carry average versus his running back teammates' average. He outpaced them by 1.91 yards per attempt. Like I said, it's very tough to say exactly how Green Bay is going to deploy their running backs now that Jones is no longer suspended. They might favor the player who pass protects well, or they might go with the better runner, who I believe is Aaron Jones. But the reason I'm buying Aaron Jones altogether is because I do think he has by far the highest ceiling in this offense. Drop Jared Goff. I don't know if you guys heard, but quarterback is a replaceable position in fantasy football. That means that you don't have to feel tied to a particular quarterback unless that player is truly in an elite tier. Unless that player is someone like Patrick Mahomes. But with Jared Goff, he's been totally fine for the Rams, but his fantasy football production just hasn't been anything special. And he's had a couple of plus matchups. And upcoming for LA is a game against a pretty good Chargers secondary, followed by a matchup against the Vikings. So streaming may give you a better chance than playing Jared Goff through those 2 games. Add Giovanni Bernard. Now I know, guys, Giovanni Bernard is not available in your league, but he is available in plenty of them. Over on ESPN.com, 60% of fantasy leagues list Giovanni Bernard as a free agent. So I have to call him out on this week's podcast. And he's deserving of a top claim given Joe Mixon's knee injury. In 2 games last year without Joe Mixon, Giovanni Bernard carried the ball 25 times and he saw 13 targets. That translated to a 75.8% rushing share and a 20% target share. That's the kind of usage that you generally see from really elite running backs in fantasy football. So that's going to make Giovanni Bernard a plug-and-play option while Joe Mixon is sidelined. Buy Jack Doyle. So Eric Ebron scored again in week 2, and he now has over 11 more fantasy points scored than teammate Jack Doyle. But when you start to dig in a little bit, you start to realize that Jack Doyle is the tight end that you want in that Indianapolis offense. You can start with snap counts. There's obviously a correlation between fantasy points scored and snap counts because players need to be on the field in order to score points. Through 2 games, Eric Ebron's played 54 snaps. It's about 38% of the team's snaps. Jack Doyle's played 136 of them. That's about 95% of the team's snaps. Now I get it. Hypothetically, tight ends can be asked to block a lot, and that lowers their receiving performance. But Jack Doyle has run 81 routes so far this year, and Eric Ebron has run 34. You can even look at just straight up volume and see the difference between the 2 tight ends. Jack Doyle has 15 targets, and Eric Ebron has 9. Now, Eric Ebron can have standalone value this year, and his role might increase as things move forward. But Jack Doyle is the one that you want on your fantasy football roster, and there's a potential buy opportunity entering week 3, given Eric Ebron's performance. Add Antonio Callaway. So with Josh Gordon no longer in the picture for Cleveland, someone had to step up. And that someone was rookie Antonio Callaway, who played 80.6% of the Browns snaps against the Saints. and he hauled in 3 of his 4 targets for 81 yards and a really awesome touchdown. And something that's somewhat significant is he did play more snaps than Rashard Higgins. Rashard Higgins was actually on the field more than Antonio Callaway in week 1. So of the two, between Callaway and Higgins, Callaway to me easily has more upside given his raw ability, making him worth an add off the waiver wire after what we saw in New Orleans. Sell Carlos Hyde. So Carlos Hyde has 38 rushes through Cleveland's first 2 games. It's one of the higher marks in the entire NFL. But the problem is he's only seen 3 targets and Duke Johnson is digging into his snaps. Carlos Hyde's been on the field for about 53% of Cleveland's offensive plays, while Duke Johnson has a snap rate at about 46%. Touchdowns have really helped Carlos Hyde in fantasy football, but those are bound to regress in the wrong way. He totaled 105 rushing yards, and according to running back data over the past half decade, a standard back seeing that many rushing yards would be expected to score 0.7 touchdowns on the ground. That means that Carlos Hyde is overexceeded in the touchdown column by about 1.3 touchdowns. That's pretty big after only 2 games. So given the lack of receiving volume, the fact that he's not playing a ton of snaps, and this negative touchdown regression that is to come, Carlos Hyde makes for a pretty obvious sell candidate this week. Add Tyler Boyd. So the fantasy football world was ready for John Ross's breakout, and then Tyler Boyd snuck in and he completely ruined it. Boyd has been Cincinnati's slot guy, but he's also been on the field more than John Ross. He's outsnapped him 106-81. And Tyler Boyd's been productive so far this year. He's seen 14 targets, 9 receptions, 117 yards, and a touchdown. Those 14 targets translate to a strong 20% target share. And if you look at Cincinnati's schedule, it's awesome. It's amazing for their passing attack. And it's even more amazing, arguably, for a slot receiver. He really doesn't have a scary matchup until December. So I think that Tyler Boyd could honestly serve as a wide receiver 3 or a wide receiver 4 in fantasy football this year. Buy Will Fuller. So last season, I admittedly talked about Will Fuller over and over again as a sell candidate due to the obvious negative regression that was about to hit. In 4 games with Deshaun Watson last year, Will Fuller scored 7 times. With 279 receiving yards during that span, we should have expected him to score closer to 1 or 2 touchdowns. He scored 7. And then in Will Fuller's first game of the season on Sunday, he went out and scored a touchdown. But to me, it's not an obvious sell situation this time around. We've already started to see Deshaun Watson post these non-ridiculous numbers. He's already starting to regress. But one thing that hasn't changed with Deshaun Watson is his tendency to throw the ball deep. In just 2 games, Deshaun Watson has thrown 19 passes that have traveled 15 or more yards through the air. That means that nearly 29% of his passes have gone deep, which is an even higher rate than what we saw from him last year when he ranked first within the statistic. Now, Will Fuller is a deep ball player who's bound to see the second most looks on the Houston Texans. He won't score at the rate that he did last year, but he really is the perfect match for Deshaun Watson. And he should have a higher than expected floor each week, just given the lack of reliable options in the Texans offense. Add Buck Allen. So a concern for Alex Collins going into the 2018 season was that he wasn't the clear-cut goal line back for Baltimore. And this isn't me just saying this after the fact. I wrote about it in my week 1 The Report column. But since, the Ravens have run 6 plays within the opponent's 5-yard line, with 4 of those being rushes. Buck Allen has 2 of those carries, and Alex Collins has 1. Now, I don't think it's time for Alex Collins owners to completely panic. It just means that Buck Allen may get in the way of Collins' ceiling in that offense, which limits his overall upside. But for those of you that see Buck Allen sitting on your waiver wire, snag him. Get him this week. Not only is he going to get work at the goal line, but he's continued to be a receiving threat in that Ravens offense. He has 13 targets over the first 2 games. Seeing looks at the goal line and through the air is perfect for a fantasy football running back because touchdowns are everything and targets are more valuable than rushing attempts. And keep in mind, in Buck Allen's 2 full seasons in the league, he's had 60 or more targets. It's not like this usage is just coming out of nowhere. Sell Kyle Rudolph. So we know this, that at best, Kyle Rudolph is the 3rd best option in that Minnesota Vikings offense. He's behind Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. And it was that way last year. Kyle Rudolph tallied 15.4% of Minnesota's targets. But this year, that number's actually dropped to just shy of 12%, with Laquan Treadwell seeing more looks in that offense. And Kyle Rudolph is coming off a fluky week 1 performance where he caught 1 of his 2 targets for a touchdown, and then in week 2, Minnesota threw the ball 48 times in a game that went into overtime. That helped Kyle Rudolph get to 8 targets. It's not that he's this horrible tight end option, it's just that the market might view Kyle Rudolph as better than he actually is. That's why you can try to sell him. Add James Washington. So James Washington had just one reception in Pittsburgh's Week 2 loss, but there's reason to add the rookie wideout now instead of waiting. He was on the field for over 80% of Pittsburgh's snaps against Kansas City, making it clear that he was the team's number 3 wide receiver. And he ran just 6 fewer routes than Antonio Brown and 5 fewer than Juju Smith-Schuster. So on a team that can put up points and could be throwing a lot this year, he should have your attention. Now is the time to add James Washington. Don't wait until next week. Add Ryan Fitzpatrick. So at some point, Ryan Fitzpatrick will slow down. I don't want to live in that world. I love what's going on with Ryan Fitzpatrick right now, but it's bound to happen. But it might not happen this week, because Fitzpatrick will be at home against Pittsburgh in a game that has predictably one of the highest over-unders of the week. We know that Pittsburgh's defense is mediocre, and it has been thus far in 2018. And they've also been beat deep. Only Kansas City has seen more deep balls thrown against them to start the year than Pittsburgh has, and just 4 quarterbacks have heaved it deep more than Ryan Fitzpatrick this year. And Ryan Fitzpatrick is averaging the highest yards per attempt on those throws. We're absolutely dealing with small sample sizes here. And there's absolutely no way that Ryan Fitzpatrick is going to keep this up. But the matchup is there this week. Ryan Fitzpatrick could be a QB1 once again. Add the Cleveland Browns defense. Guys, the Cleveland defense is more legit than most probably think. And they've got a really good matchup at home in week 2. They're going up against the Jets in a game with a 39-point over-under, and they're 3-point home favorites. In Sam Darnold's first 2 NFL starts, he's been picked off 3 times, and he's taken 5 sacks. So dare I say, the Cleveland Browns might be the best streaming defense of the week. So as always, I got a 16th transaction that you can't find in my 15 transactions column on numberfire.com. And this week's is a little bit of a deeper one, and it's to add Zay Jones. Jones has actually played the most snaps at wide receiver for Buffalo in both weeks 1 and 2. He's played more than Kelvin Benjamin, and he's seen just 1 fewer target than Kelvin Benjamin has. Now, I'm not advocating that you go pick up Zay Jones and you start him. But as a second-year receiver, he has the most upside on that team. And it's a team that should hypothetically grow as the season moves forward. So this is nothing more than a stash and an interesting thing that I saw in week 2. Chances are I'm only speaking to about 10% of you who can actually roster someone like Zay Jones, but I figured that I'd call it out. And I also want to call out that a lot of times previous transactions are still in effect for the current week. Not all of them are, because I do get things wrong, but I will say that I'm still selling Adrian Peterson, I still really don't like Derrick Henry, and I'm not really that into Jacksonville wide receivers who aren't named Keelan Cole. Hopefully that adds a little juice to this miserable 16th transaction that I gave you guys this week. Anyway, that's going to be it for today's 15 Transactions show. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. And make sure you're following me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. You can holler at me there with any questions that you might have for this week's mailbag episode. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you later in the week.